In this mini lecture, we'll discuss leaf cuttings. Leaf cuttings are similar to root cuttings in that they have to produce both new adventitious shoots and roots. And also like root cuttings, the original leaf piece will not become part of the new plant. It simply provides the cells and energy necessary to produce those new roots and shoots, and then it's going to decay and disappear. So leaf and root cuttings both have to produce new roots and shoots. Stem cuttings only have to produce new roots. Now, the leaf cutting is opposite from the root cutting in that roots will originate more easily than shoots. That means on a leaf cutting, it's going to form adventitious roots first, then shoots. Root cuttings are opposite. They do adventitious shoots first, then roots. Now, there are three major types of leaf cuttings: the leaf blade cutting, leaf blade and petiole, and leaf bud or bud shield. These names just indicate what part of the leaf tissue you're using. So the picture here shows some leaf cuttings of African violet. African violets can actually be propagated by both leaf blade and petiole cuttings. So let's look at some examples. Let's start with our friend the snake plant. Snake plants can be propagated by leaf blade only cuttings. In fact, that's all they have. They don't have petioles and they don't have buds. They just have leaf blades. Now, the snake plant pictured on the left is a cultivar called Laurentii. So the scientific name is Sansevieria trifasciata laurentii. And Laurentii is a cultivar that has that wide yellow stripe around the margin of the leaf. Now this is a chimera. So remember, chimeras can't be propagated by root cuttings or leaf cuttings. You can get a new plant using leaf cuttings of this plant, but it won't have the chimeric mutation. So if you propagate Laurentii by leaf cuttings, what you'll get is a phenotype like that in the picture on the right, where it's just a regular green leaf snake plant with no yellow stripe around the margin. Now, think back to your Freaks and Mutants lecture. Which histogenic layer do you think is mutated to cause that yellow stripe? If you thought of L1, that is the correct answer. So then the next question is, well, how can I propagate Laurentii if I want to get a new plant with a yellow stripe? I can't do stem cuttings because it doesn't have stems. I can't graft it. You can't graft snake plants. So what do? Well, the only option for propagating this one is division. So here's how you take a leaf blade only cutting of a snake plant. This is another one where it's easy to get your polarity mixed up. Polarity is weakest in leaves, so it's strongest in stem cuttings and then a little weaker in root cuttings and very weak in leaf cuttings, but you can't completely disregard it. So this is one where it would be important to make a straight cut on one end and a slanted on the other to remind yourself which is the proximal and which is the distal end. Now the leaf cutting is pretty similar to a stem cutting in that the proximal end is going to form roots. And that's really all you have to remember. That's all you have to keep track of for this, is to remember which is the proximal end. We usually have our students cut a slanted cut on the proximal end and a straight cut on the distal end, so that they'll remember that the proximal end, the slanted end, is the end that you put in the media, because that's where the roots will come from. And here's a picture to show you a rooted snake leaf plant cutting. So the one on the right is not quite as far along as the one on the left. You can see the adventitious roots on it, and if you look right here, you see a little meristem forming that will eventually become the new shoot. The one on the left has both the roots and you can see the shoot is starting to emerge, that new adventitious shoot. Rex begonia, which is another common house plant, this is another plant that is propagated by leaf blade only cuttings. And there's two ways you can do it. The first is pictured on the left. In both of those pictures, you essentially cut out the center of the leaf, cut it into little wedge-like shapes, and stick the proximal end in the media. I should add that for both of these, and for leaf cuttings in general, it does help to put rooting hormone on that proximal end. So that's going to be true of almost all of our leaf cuttings. However, root cuttings do not need rooting hormone. So you do put it on leaf and stem cuttings, you don't put it on root cuttings. It won't hurt anything, but it won't help anything either. Another way to propagate Rex begonia by leaf blade only cuttings is shown in the picture on the right. What you do is you flip your leaf over to the underside, and using a razor blade or a knife, you carefully cut slits in various places along the major veins of the leaf. Then you flip it back over and you put it bottom side down, the cut side down, on media. Now they've got little rocks on top of their leaf to just hold it down because you want those cut veins to be in direct contact with the media. Because what will then happen is this. You get a small new plantlet forming at every place that you cut the vein. And then the original leaf again will decay and disappear, and you'll have several new plantlets. So Rex begonia is a little different than a lot of other leaf cuttings. It's very interesting to watch. Our African violet, again, you can propagate by leaf blade only or leaf blade and petiole, which is what you see in the picture on the left. You can see the new plantlets emerging near the base of the petiole, which has been treated with rooting hormone. And in the picture on the right, you can see that with African violets, we have a lot of cultivars, and some of them have sort of fancy flowers with multicolored petals or fringed frilly petals, as you can see in the picture here. A lot of times those are chimeras, so if you propagate them by the leaf cutting, you won't get the fancy flowers. However, it's impossible to tell just by looking at it, so the only way you can really find out is just propagate it by a leaf cutting and see if it looks the same as the parent. If it doesn't, you know it was a chimera. If it does, then it wasn't a chimera. This is a pretty cool one. The sundew plant is a carnivorous plant, so at the end of each of those little red hairs is a sticky drop of liquid, dew if you will, that bugs will get stuck on, and then the leaf sort of curls around them and digests them. Now if you look at the leaf segments down in the right corner there, you can see the new plantlets arriving from them as well. So a very interesting one to look at, and they have it here in a media very similar to a tissue culture media, but you could use a regular cutting potting soil like media as well if you wanted to. Here are a few more plants you can propagate using the leaf blade and petiole type of leaf cutting. The one on the bottom is called a flame violet. It's related to African violets. And the one on the top is called baby rubber plant. The scientific name is peperomia, and there are several species out there sold as house plants. Now you'll notice it's variegated, which again means it's probably a chimera. And the picture on the top right shows some possibilities of adventitious shoots that might form on leaf cuttings of this plant. Depending on which histogenic layer the adventitious shoot forms from, it could be variegated, or it could be an albino like the one on the top left, although that one will die because it can't photosynthesize. However, these are just possibilities. They're not what usually happens. What typically happens are all of the ones that you see there where you have a solid green shoot system, because most often the adventitious shoot is not going to arise from the mutated layer. All of the plants on this slide belong to a group known as succulents, and these are plants that hold a lot of water. They can store a lot of water, often as an adaptation to a dry environment. Now the one on the left is a trick. That's a Christmas cactus, and I put it in here because people often think that that cutting there is a leaf cutting. It looks like a leaf cutting. But Christmas cactuses actually have these strangely adapted stems that are very wide and flat. So what that actually is a stem cutting. I simply put it here because people confuse it with leaf cuttings. However, you can know it's a stem cutting because when this is propagated, it forms adventitious roots, and then that original piece does continue to be a part of the new plant. It just continues to grow, so it's obviously a stem cutting. The one on the right is a common houseplant known as burro's tail. The scientific name is Sedum morganianum, and each one of those grape-like leaves can simply be plucked off and used as a leaf cutting. And the picture at the top there, you can see the original burro's tail leaf. It's formed both roots and a new shoot, and it will eventually decay. Now succulents are special both for stem and leaf cuttings in that you don't want to stick them in the media immediately after you take the cutting. The reason is they hold so much water that they'll just get too moist and they tend to rot. What you want to do instead with a succulent plant is to take your cutting, stem or leaf, and just let it sit out on the counter for about 24 hours. During that time period, it's going to form a lot of callus where you cut it to seal it off to help keep out diseases, and then you can stick it in the media after 24 hours and it'll work a lot better. These ones you can use rooting hormone on, but you don't have to. They usually root even without it. Our last type of leaf cutting is the leaf bud cutting, which is also sometimes referred to as a single eye cutting, a single node cutting, or a bud shield cutting. This is really somewhat of a stem cutting masquerading as a leaf cutting, but we're going to leave it under leaf cuttings. A leaf bud cutting contains the blade, the petiole, and a vegetative bud with a small piece of the stem, as you see in the picture here. Now, pretty much no woody plants can be propagated by leaf blade only or leaf blade and petiole cuttings. It's just not going to work. However, some woody plants can be propagated by leaf bud cuttings. And the advantage is that you can get a lot more new plants off your stock plant with a leaf bud cutting than you could with a stem cutting. Think about it. A leaf bud cutting only has to have one node. A stem cutting usually has 2 or 3 nodes or more, but it's got to have at least 2. So that means using leaf bud cuttings, you could get twice as many new plants off your stock plant than you could with stem cuttings. So that's the whole point of a leaf bud cutting. Now, there still aren't a lot of woody plants that you can use leaf bud cuttings for, but there are some, and I've listed them here. And so, again, if this is the type of plant you're trying to propagate, it's a good, easy way to get a lot of plants off your stock plant, more so than stem cuttings. Now, one very important thing with leaf budded cuttings is that you need to make sure you have a well-developed vegetative bud. This bud shown here is not really a very good vegetative bud. It's not big and well-developed. The reason why this is so important is that's where your new shoot system is going to come from. So unlike other types of leaf cuttings, leaf bud cuttings actually only produce adventitious roots, and then the new shoot system is contained within that vegetative bud on your cutting. So if it's a good, large, well-developed vegetative bud, the shoot system is already developed, and so once the roots form, that bud will just break and form your new shoot system. Now, that original leaf is not going to be part of the new plant, just like with the other leaf cuttings, it's just going to fall off. But again, if you don't have a good bud on it, you won't get a good shoot system, and it just won't be a successful cutting. So with that, we end our discussion of leaf cuttings, and our next one will be on other types of cuttings.